Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. My name is Pat Murphy, Head of Environment Knowledge Transfer with Teagasc, and our series is supported by Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland Skillnet, and the National Rural Network. This morning, we're delighted to be joined by Daniel Henn. Daniel is a PhD student based in the University of Limerick and working in conjunction with some of our Teagasc colleagues in Solihull. Daniel, you're very welcome.
Thanks, Pat. Good morning, everyone.
And I'm also joined by Andy Boland. Andy, you're very welcome this morning. Daniel, your topic this morning is examining pathways for climate neutrality, and exploring the national herd and grassland management to meet climate targets. It's a big contentious issue. How did you find yourself in Ireland studying in relation to this topic?
Yeah, I've definitely come to learn that there's I think a few interests that are clashing there in Ireland sometimes, but it's very interesting, and I'm very happy that I can be a part of the challenge that the agricultural sector is now facing with reducing the emissions and trying to find some solutions for that.
Okay, I suppose without further ado, then I might get you to share your presentation and begin your presentation.
Thanks, Pat. I think most of us are aware of the massive climate challenge that Ireland is facing now. So over the past just over 20 years, we've seen two different developments in Ireland. First of all, an extensification period from the late 90s to around 2010, 2011, when intensification started, especially from the dairy sector, post EU milk quotas. And we've seen that emissions are very closely connected to total cattle numbers, which have grown from about 6.6 million in 2011 up to 7.3 million in 2020. At present, there's a 25% emission reduction target compared to 2018 values for the agricultural sector, which means that emissions lower than they were at the bottom within this time series in 2011 are required. And another important thing to note is that here in this chart, you can see with the yellow lines that the land use change and forestry sector is also a net source of carbon, whereas it is a carbon sink actually in most other European countries, and is closely connected to the grassland resources used for agriculture in Ireland. So that adds a little bit of a challenge to the agricultural sector, I suppose. Just shortly mentioned the Goblin model there. So this has been developed over the past few years. It's a biophysical land model that aims to investigate scenarios to achieve climate neutrality within Ireland on different scales. So most importantly for the agriculture and land use sector, so the FOLU sector as a whole, I suppose. It consists of 10 different submodules. At the top left there, you can see animal production, and these animals feed on something, of course. So we have module 2, which are concentrate feeds, that is very closely connected to crop production there at the bottom, and then we have grass production and fertilizer use. And these are the 5 modules that I'm going to be talking about in particular today. Especially because the outcome from the grass production that you can see there at the top between modules 3 and 6 is land available for other users. So land sparing opportunities from current grassland areas. And within the model, these can then be converted into rewetting of drained organic soils for agricultural purposes, new forest areas, so afforestation, wood use, as well as bioenergy crops, and also biogas. And some of the results that Colin Duffy and everyone else who was working with Goblin also in the sequester project over the past few years, some interesting results that they found is that in total they randomized scenarios, a total of 850 of them, and there were 3 different outcomes. So there at the top left, you can see in the legend that the 3 outcomes are either the failure to achieve net zero, to achieve net zero within the Afolo sector, or to even achieve net zero on the national scale, which means that the Afolo sector kind of would create enough of a carbon sink to account for all other sectors as well. And then in figure A at the top left, we can see that to achieve net zero for the Afolo sector, we require large reductions within dairy population, beef population, as well as upland and lowland sheep, going down from the current, for example, for dairy, from the current 1.5 million to around 700,000 on average for these successful scenarios. And then we can see on the top right that about 2 million hectares need to be spared, and about 1 million hectares of them are forested. So that would be about a quarter of all current land, grassland, I suppose, in Ireland. And there's a few caveats to these results that I will come back to at the end. But this is something that has been discussed quite controversially, I suppose, over the past few weeks, and one of the outcomes from these randomized scenarios. So I want to go a little bit more into how Goblin works, starting with the cohorts model. So that will be on the animal production side of things. This is a model that is comprised of 21 total cattle cohorts. So we start at the top there in the adult stage, where we have dairy cows, bulls, and then beef cows. And then we move towards 6, what we call grand cohorts. So based on gender and genetics, these grand cohorts are built. And we have dairy, so pure dairy calves there on the left, DXD, male and female. Then in the middle, we have dairy beef crossbreeds, DXB, also male and female. And then on the right, pure beef calves, BXB, also male and female. And then we have for all of these pre-adult stage cohorts, we have 3 different age groups. So these would be below 1 year, 1 to 2 years, and over 2 years. And all of these cohorts were developed using real export and slaughter data, as well as cohort-specific live weight gains based on average slaughter ages and weights from the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation. Then moving to the grassland model, which is very, very closely connected to these animals. We start there on the left side on a per hectare level, where we use yield response functions combined with inorganic fertilizer rates and also organic fertilizer rates to get grass yields. And we apply a small soil yield gap, which means, depending on the soil type in Ireland, 1 to 3, a little bit of productivity is deducted, I suppose, the further we go down towards the group 3. And these grass yields are for 3 different farm types. So we have dairy, cattle, and sheep. And then we have 3 sub-grassland types in all of these, which would be pasture, silage, hay, and rough grazing. So we end up with a total of 12 different average yields. With these, we move down towards the farm level, where we use data from the National Farm Survey, average farm herds, and calculate first of all, their energy requirements based on the IPCC Tier 2 approach, and subsequently end up with the dry matter requirements of these average herds. And then we combine that with dry matter production based on average areas and the yields that I just mentioned. And we end up with a utilization rate or grassland use efficiency. On the farm level, that we then assume to be the case as well for the national level. So there we look at national herds and their dry matter requirements, and then combine that with the average yields, with the utilization rate, and we end up with the total grassland areas that are calculated by the Goblin model for Ireland. So for the scenarios that I'm going to be talking about now, we moved away from the randomized scenarios and came up with 9 specific scenarios that explore the effects of changing herd compositions or grassland management practices on 6 different outputs. These would be total cattle numbers, protein output, the climate impact, air and water quality, fertilizer use, as well as then the total grassland area. And one thing that should be emphasized is that emission mitigation and offsetting does require land, what we've seen from the results that I showed earlier, whether that be for afforestation, for wetland restoration, or also for green energy production, be in the form of energy crops or wind energy plants, solar panels. All of these do require a certain amount of land, some more than others. So to start with the first scenario, we established a 2020 baseline. So these are the total cattle numbers, 6.76 million. And in this figure, you can see the distribution between dairy calves, dairy beef calves, and beef calves that would be born in this scenario year. And we go to the protein output, and there we accumulated the protein content of milk and beef. So for milk, we assumed a protein content of 3.5%. For beef, we assumed 23%. Which leaves us with a total of 442 kilotons that are of pure protein that are produced in Ireland, and we have a split of about 2/3 of milk and 1/3 of beef contributing to that. Then we look at fertilizer utilization, pretty straightforward. We have N, P, and K. Then we look at global warming potential, so that would be the greenhouse gas emissions specifically from the agricultural sector, given as CO2 equivalent. So in 2020, we would have 20.3 megatons, according to the Goblin model. And you can see the split between methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, where even though the unit that we use is carbon dioxide equivalents, there's very, very small outputs of actual CO2 from the agricultural sector, and the majority coming from methane, and then the smaller proportion from nitrous oxide. Other environmental impacts that we looked at were, first of all, ammonia, so very closely connected to air quality. And then for water quality, nutrient leaching, so we look at nitrogen and phosphorus that would be, entering water bodies through the soil. And finally, our grassland areas, so 4.01 million hectares for Ireland in 2020. We can see that dairy areas make up for about 25%, cattle areas for 50%, and then sheep farms for another 25%. So now coming to the first two scenarios that we looked at, these are concerned with dairy expansion, or you could even say dairy specialization, I suppose. So I mentioned it earlier, we've seen a strong growth of the dairy sector due to a combination of policies and market forces, especially since 2010. Where we can really see the green line, so the dairy cows starting to pick up. And what we can also see is that beef cow numbers have declined, but not at the same rate as we've seen an increase in dairy cows. So that means that total numbers have risen since then. So just to come back to our baseline, for that we were working with 1.55 million dairy cows and then 915,000 beef cows. And now for scenario 2, we're looking at 2 million dairy cows and 470,000 beef cows. So that means keeping total cow numbers stable. And then for scenario 3, we're looking at 2.25 million dairy cows and 0 beef cows. So that means a little bit of a reduction of total cow numbers. And I can preface all of these scenarios by saying that really what we were trying to achieve with these scenarios is kind of establishing the borders of what is possible with these scenarios. So you might find that, I think we're never going to be looking at 2.25 million dairy cows and 0 beef cows at the same time. So I just want to preface this by saying that we're establishing the borders here with these scenarios. So scenario 2, strong dairy expansion. So 2 million dairy cows and then just over 400,000 beef cows, which means that also in all of these 6 boxes now, you can see on the left side the results from the scenario year, and then on the right side, from the baseline year on the left side, and then on the right side from the specific scenario. So we can see in this one, total cattle numbers remain roughly the same. We get an increase of about 80,000 tons of protein, largely coming from milk. And then we see slightly smaller fertilizer use, more or less the same CO2 equivalents being emitted, and also nutrients leached. And then we would end up there at the bottom right with about 170,000 hectares that would be spared from this scenario. And you can see that that the split slightly changes between the three farm types. So we would see that dairy makes up quite a bit of ground at the expense of cattle farms there. Then for scenario 3, the dairy maximization, we can see that in line with total cow numbers declining, there's also about just over 600,000 decrease of total cattle numbers. And we can see that now there's no more beef calves being born, and the split between calves is about 50-50 for dairy and for dairy beef. Protein output increases even further, and now we can see that about 80% of the protein would be coming from milk and about 20% coming from beef. So for this scenario, actually, we see that compared to the baseline, milk output increases by just under 50%, while beef output declines only by just about 20%. So that's why we have this total increase. Then we see fertilizer use declining by about 50 kilotons there for nitrogen, and also for phosphorus by about 7 tons. For the environmental impacts, we see that about 1.1 megatons is sparred from agricultural emissions, and we can see that this scenario decreases ammonia emissions by about 14 tons, and actually puts us very close to Ireland's emission target for ammonia, or I suppose EU guidelines for ammonia emissions. When we're looking at total spared land now, this scenario ends up sparing just under 600,000 hectares, and we can see that the area of dairy has almost doubled and is now a larger proportion compared to cattle farms. Then for scenario 4, we looked at slaughter age reduction, and in the Climate Action Plan 2021 that was established by the government of Ireland, it is called for a reduction of the average slaughter age from about 27 months to 24 months until 2030. So a very ambitious target. Our calculations suggest that between 2010 and 2020, the slaughter ages across all cohorts were reduced by a maximum of up to 50 days. So that means these targets actually almost aim to double what has been achieved over the past 10 years, I suppose. So that's what our scenario 4 investigates, reducing the average slaughter age by 90 days, with an important caveat that the slaughter weights actually remain the same. So that means that we have a massive increase in terms of average daily weight gain. So the results are a decrease of total cattle numbers, and that's mainly because the average slaughter age has decreased. So we see fewer cattle above 2 years that remain on grass before they are slaughtered. Protein output's almost the same, just because we keep these slaughter weights constant, and then we can see that fertilizer use went down a little bit. Environmental impacts roughly stayed the same, and then in terms of grassland use, we see about 190,000 hectares that would be spared from this scenario, mostly coming from cattle farms as well. Then for scenarios 5 and 6, we looked at the export of male dairy calves, which are often considered as a byproduct of milk production, just because they have relatively slow weight gain compared to pure beef calves, but also compared to the crossbreeds, these dairy beef calves as well. So for scenario 5, we investigated a scenario with no export of male dairy calves, just to maximize the beef production in Ireland. And for scenario 6, we assume that all male dairy calves are exported to improve the efficiency of beef production in Ireland itself. And for 2020, so kind of the baseline year, about 30% of these male dairy calves were exported within the first, I believe it's 6 weeks after their birth. So just to give you a bit of context there. So for the first scenario, the export minimization, we can see that total cattle numbers slightly increase. we can see a very little effect in terms of increase of protein production. I think this emphasizes that beef production is just not that efficient from these dairy male calves. We see an increase in terms of fertilizer use as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And then overall, we end up with about 100,000 additional hectares of grassland that would be required for this scenario. Then we move to the export maximization. So now all of the calves being exported, which leads to about 550,000 less cattle. And obviously all of these coming from dairy, so that proportion going down there a bit. We look at a decrease of about 5% in terms of protein output. And then, this kind of 5% decrease we can see almost across all results. So fertilizer use, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as nutrients leaching and ammonia emissions. And then we end up with about 200,000 hectares of spared land from that scenario. So for scenario 7, we move to sex semen, which means altering the gender ratio of born calves in this context. There are some problems with conception rate at present. So some Teagasc figures are suggesting that these are about 10% lower than conventional semen. That's not something that we take into account. So for this scenario, we are hopeful that this difference in conception rate can be overcome, I suppose. And there is potential to contribute to lowering the number of dairy male calves and also increasing the ratio of male births for dairy beef and beef to enable faster weight accumulation, just because the male cattle accumulate weight ever so slightly faster compared to the females. So for this scenario, we looked at altered birth rates of 75% female and 25% male for dairy, and then vice versa, 75% male, 25% female for dairy beef and beef. And the results here actually came to us as a little bit of a surprise, because as you can see, there's almost no change at all between the scenario and the baseline here. So about a 1% increase, maybe you can say, across all of the results. So protein, fertilizer, very slight increase in emissions, and more or less the same for ammonia and for nutrients leaching. And then we end up with about 40,000 hectares, give or take, more from this scenario. So very interesting results here. Then we looked at grassland use efficiency. I alluded to it earlier in the grassland tool of the Goblin model. So these are the results that we get here. Grassland use efficiency does describe the proportion of produced dry matter on farms that is actually taken up by animals. So we can see here that the green line at the very top, so our dairy farms and our cattle farms there at the bottom with the black line, they follow a very similar pattern, with the difference that dairy farms consistently have about 15 to 20% larger grassland use efficiency compared with cattle farms, is what the Goblin model is suggesting. So our scenario 8 would be to improve the grassland use efficiency on cattle farms by about 10%. So that would mean halfway closing the gap towards dairy farms. So the results there, no changes in cattle numbers, no changes in protein output, as these remain the same, obviously. Then also very low impact for emissions, both greenhouse gases and also ammonia and also nutrient leaching. But the important bit here on the right, so we have about 10% less fertilizer use, and we end up with about 310,000 hectares that would be spared from improving this grassland use efficiency, and all of that coming obviously from cattle farms as well. Then for our final scenario, we're looking at combining all of these scenarios. So that means 2.25 million dairy cows, 0 beef cows. We have a 90-day reduction of the average slaughter age. We have a full export of all male dairy calves. We also have sex semen, And then we have the 10% increase in grassland use efficiency on cattle farms. So where that takes us is to a decrease in total cattle numbers of just over 1 million. So we're at roughly 5.7 million there. And we can see that the split is vastly different now from what we've seen before. Basically only female dairy cattle as replacements there in the dairy cohort, and then the rest would be dairy beef, especially now 75% male because we have the sex semen as well. In terms of protein, we end up with 100,000 tons in exceeding the baseline. And once again, we can see that the split is now about 80% milk and 20% coming from beef. In terms of fertilizer use, we see a decrease of about 20% across the three different nutrients there. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector, we see a decrease of about 1.5 megatons. Most of that coming from methane, as you can see there in these two figures at the bottom left. Then we see a decrease of about 20% as well, roughly a little bit less maybe, when it comes to the other environmental impacts, so ammonia emissions, nutrient leaching. And then finally, we see that about 750,000 hectares of grassland would be spared from this scenario. And now, once again, dairy is the largest proportion, and cattle farms are only making up for about 1 million hectares now in this scenario. So to give a quick summary of the results that I just presented here, a further dairy specialization could increase total protein output while decreasing land requirements as well. And that is with the important caveat that dairy cow numbers rise in the same fashion or at the same speed that we see a decrease in beef cows. So that's important there. So for this hypothesis to stand, I suppose. Then we see a slaughter age reduction decreases cattle numbers while maintaining protein output and also sparing land. When it comes to the export of dairy male calves, it is favorable from an Irish greenhouse gas inventory perspective. We could see the emissions drop down a little bit there, land getting spared. But from a global greenhouse gas inventory perspective, maximizing the beef from dairy animals does reduce emissions, just because of the dual purpose, if you want to call it that, from dairy cows that contribute obviously to milk production and then also to beef production with their offspring, compared to beef cows with and their offspring, which are obviously have the purpose to produce beef rather than beef and milk. Then we could see that the sex semen scenario had very little effect on any of the investigated results. We saw that the grassland use efficiency improvement lowered fertilizer applications as well as spared land. And one additional important result is that about 90% of the spared land in the investigated scenarios is actually on soil groups 1 and 2, just because most of the soil group 3 would be on sheep farms, according to the National Farm Survey. So that means that about 90% of spared land is on very productive soils. We see about a 50-50 split between soil group 1 and soil group 2 within these 90%. So a lot of very productive land that is actually getting spared here. Finally, my final conclusion. So this will be the last slide. Hope haven't gone too far over the time. So the examined scenarios could contribute towards 2030 climate targets, while it's also increasing protein output. They also could spare large areas of good quality land, as I just explained with these two different soil types there. They could help to develop a more diversified bioeconomy, and for 2050 climate neutrality in the FOLO sector. There are a little bit more than 500,000 hectares of afforestation required. So going back to the results that I talked about earlier from the Goblin model, from the 850 randomized scenarios, these actually do take into account that all methane, all nitrous oxide does need to be accounted for with CO2 removals there. While in recent time the discussion has moved a little bit away from that. And if we see methane set a separate target and doesn't need to be offset by CO2 removals in the same way, that leaves us with about a little bit more than 500,000 hectares of afforestation needed to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 for Ireland. And as well, climate neutrality will require strong reductions in methane and nitrous oxide, about 50%. So that means other agricultural practices will be very important. A few examples, there are many more, of course, would be animal breeding and feed additives to reduce methane emissions directly from cattle. And then some things that we're looking to investigate in the next projects with the Goblin model as well. How can low performance farms close the gap to medium and high performance farms? So what are some management practices there, especially from a national perspective as well? And then clover grass systems. So that's something that a lot of work has been done on within Teagasc as well, and at the Sollerhead Research Farm, and some very, very promising results there, that a lot of the fertilizer inputs can be reduced by these clover swards. So that's something that we're also going to be investigating very soon. Also improved slurry management, and then abated urea fertilizers to further reduce nitrous oxide. So combining all of these factors and the herd composition will determine future sustainable level of bovine protein production in Ireland. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. And I want to thank everyone who contributed to this project. So namely James Humphreys, David Stiles, Colin Duffy, James Gibbons, Remy Prudhomme, and also thank you to the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine for funding this project.
Listen, thank you very much. Thought-provoking. I suppose one of the things that we probably, you talked at the end about some of the technologies, but am I right to assume that you had a kind of a static level of adoption of a series of mitigating technologies in the main analysis?
Exactly, yeah, and that's an important thing to mention and to discuss as well. When it comes to I suppose calling them purely agricultural measures that are being talked about now to lower greenhouse gas emissions, these have not been included. So these would obviously, if there's massive improvements when it comes to lowering the greenhouse gas emissions, that would further lower the amount of land sparing that would be required.
And would it be fair to kind of say that with some of the really dramatic changes you had in the agricultural system, and I know you're not saying that these are ever going to happen, you're just putting boundaries on it just to look at the figures, but the impacts weren't as massive as you might expect. Would that be a fair comment?
I suppose it depends precisely which impacts you're talking about. When we're talking about the greenhouse gas emissions, no, the impacts are not very big, and that's because obviously we assume that the grassland, for these scenarios, we assume that the grassland is just spared and then we do nothing with it. So we don't assume any kind of afforestation or wetland restoration, any other forms of I suppose land use measures to reduce these emissions. So only purely from the agricultural emissions, no. But of course, there's very big potential that we don't see as a result of these scenarios to offset emissions from the land use sector.
Okay, Andy, a good few questions starting to
yeah.
We'd remind people to put their questions for Daniel in the Q&A.
One question there, Daniel, to have dairy cows, rearing dairy beef cows, it could lead to a lot of increase in concentrate usage. Was that modeled into any of your scenarios, or in the switch from one to the other? And I know they're pretty extreme, but did you take the amount of, or the the extra concentrate that may be used in some of the systems?
Yeah, we do, and these. I suppose just talking about the agricultural practices as well. So the concentrate utilization per dairy cow would also remain stable. So that means that the overall, when we change the overall numbers of dairy cows, that the concentrate use would go up as well. And we do have some downstream emissions within the model, so, or upstream, I suppose, from the feed production. So I suppose that would be taken into account, yes.
Yeah, there's a few questions coming in now relating to other issues, like biochar, and have you looked at, dung beetles and other things? I mean, I presume you haven't looked at any of those,
not for these particular scenarios, no.
No. Or, how water is moving down towards the soil structure. You haven't looked at any of those.
Yeah, definitely one important thing. And I suppose when we're talking about some of the agricultural measures that can be taken, on a farm level, biochar might have an even more impact on some of the nutrients that are leached compared to lowering the greenhouse gas emissions. So that's definitely something that would impact the environmental impacts as a whole, not just greenhouse gas emissions. Yes. Yeah,
and I know you've said that a lot of these scenarios you're not advocating them, but I mean there's a few comments on what we do with farmers when we get rid of dry stocks. I mean, those sorts of scenarios are.
Andy, you just broke up there for a second.
Yeah, maybe you could repeat that question, please.
Sorry, there's just a few questions there, just pulling them together on, if you drop dramatically the dry stock sector, the impact on the farmers, and obviously the use of what would happen with the land.
You just asked him about what would you do with the land insofar as you have a very big number of farmers involved in the beef sector and relatively a lot smaller number of farmers involved. And I suppose you're not proposing that this is the direction we go, but I'll let you answer.
Yes, sorry, I'm still a little bit. So the question is, what are we doing?
What are we going to do? We have you talked about the two sectors. We've probably about 90,000 beef farmers and about 18,000 dairy farmers. So it's not just I suppose a restructuring of animals. It's a huge restructuring of the farmers who farm those animals.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And like I said, I mean these scenarios are. Yeah, I don't think 2.25 million dairy cows and zero beef cows is a plan that should be advocated necessarily. Basically, creating just a large monoculture. Also talking about other aspects, of course, of sustainability, like biodiversity and things like that. But yeah, for these scenarios, we're looking at the. Basically, strictly speaking, this would mean that a lot of this area would be converted into dairy farms.
There's a question about 90% of the land is very productive land that is spared.
Ah, yes.
Is there a danger that land could be used to create further emissions?
I suppose that's the question. Then, what we do with this land? If we're talking about wetland restoration, I suppose we're talking mostly about soils from soil type 3. These organic soils. So I don't think that would be anything that is concerned. I think the question would be afforestation here, and I think that is obviously a big clash of interests, I suppose, between afforestation and between agricultural use, just because both of them are the most productive on these very very high quality soils. So I think what some of the research has shown as well, at least to my knowledge, is that afforestation is also the most effective on these lands. So. So mostly I think we would be looking at afforestation there.
Yeah, but from a farmer point of view, they're unlikely to plant quite good land. So I think that's the point that the the person was trying to make?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways. If we're looking at the national scale here, not the farm scale, which I realize is not something that you can do on your own. You have to look at the farm scale as well, and it's I realize it's not fair to the farmers to say on a national scale we have to do this. So by chance your specific farm now needs to be turned into a forest, and I mean that can't be the solution. I think that's just a little bit of a clash of interest there. And maybe if we're looking at the soil types too, which are not as productive for agricultural use as well, that might be more something to investigate for for afforestation. And that's also something that we're going to be looking at for the next projects, where we're actually working more with more of an actual spatial resolution. So not just putting the numbers here in average, but also actually mapping it out and see what potential, I suppose, target areas are to for land for afforestation and in general the land use sector to create some more emission offsets.
There's a question there, just I suppose, it's a comment or a question, just are asking that given the impact you're talking about from very significant changes, are we better to focus on mitigation of the within our existing systems rather than looking at massive system change?
I mean, this is just the underlying question in general, I suppose. I don't think only working with agricultural emissions and reducing them is going to be the trick. I think the results are showing that we do need some emissions, and I think it needs to be both. I mean, now in these scenarios, we're always looking at no improvements from the agricultural sector. And that's not going to happen as well. I think there's plenty of things that are being done there to reduce emissions. But if we're looking at reductions short term as well, for 2030 the 25% reduction target, I think it can only be a mix of both, to be honest. If we're not looking at reducing overall number of livestock, I think both of these factors have come together, and I don't think the agricultural sector will be able to hold its own, if you will, reaching these emission targets without some additions from land use.
There's I suppose again a question here in relation to the use of sex semen, and that it would probably drive up the number of beef cross calves, increasing the likelihood of them staying in the country rather than being exported, where the main export are the dairy animals. In relation to the utilization of grassland, there's a question here in terms of how you computed the efficiency of utilization of grassland across the systems, and what kind of actions would be required to get the increase that you talked about. I suppose two questions here. First one, how did we calculate them? So that would be using data from the National Farm Survey with the average farms there. So calculating all of the energy requirements for the 3 farm systems that we work with. For cattle, obviously there's a split in the National Farm Survey between cattle rearing farms and then the cattle other types. So kind of the fattening farms, I suppose. So these two we have averaged, and then we have certain assumptions within the model which of the cohorts that I presented are on which grassland type. So that's why even if we go towards a full dairy specialization, we will never see all of the cattle farms kind of being removed, just because I suppose the all of the offspring that would be used for beef production, we assume to still be on the cattle farm. So all of these dairy beef cattle that I talked about, all of them wouldn't be on dairy farms. They would still
they would still be raised kind of as far as I know is the present, is the usual way, I suppose, at present anyways. So taking these two things into account, and then the average areas for, according to the National Farm Survey as well, that's how we calculated the grassland use efficiency. And then the second part of the question, I suppose, how do we close the gap? And I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think one of the keys is that maybe dairy farms in general might have a larger proportion of actual high quality soils in the first place. So it might be an unfair comparison to make from the beginning. But I think there's potential there when it comes to maybe not even on the pasture grounds, but also in silage areas, just the grazing paddock management and things like that. I think that's where you would hope to get the most improvement out of.
Daniel, there's a couple of comments. One on, do you plan to include sheep in any of your future models?
Definitely, yeah. We've only looked at cattle scenarios now, and sheep definitely. So the areas in all of the scenarios, the sheep area obviously hasn't changed, so that has been very stable. But definitely something for the future that we're also investigating.
There's a question in there that kind of alludes to a process that we're looking at, kind of diverging agriculture into kind of almost two extremes, an extreme animal production system and an extreme, if you want to call it that, in forestry, but that there is a general lack of appreciation of the potential of that, if you want, lower output but high biodiversity agriculture that exists on a lot of beef and dairy farm, beef and sheep farms in particular. And are we undervaluing that type of farming?
When we're talking about the biodiversity perspective, I would say yes, and that's one of the maybe unfortunate parts of these mitigation scenarios as well with forestry. I don't think at all times are biodiversity and achieving the climate targets in line, unfortunately. So some scenarios from agriculture as well, when we talk about, for example, reducing intensity, reducing average livestock numbers or stocking rates, and returning them to more of a semi-natural state, if you will, that would probably do wonders for the biodiversity, but not necessarily much from a climate perspective. So unfortunately, I don't think these two go hand in hand. Of course, maybe you could argue that creating forests on a larger scale would kind of create a different kind of biodiversity. I think that's a very difficult thing to answer.
Just one other,
or maybe coming back to what you asked in the beginning, are we undervaluing what farmers are doing, and kind of the climate efforts and biodiversity efforts they are putting in? I think when I do a presentation like this, it does come across that way. Just because we're talking obviously about lowering cattle numbers and cattle farms and also dairy farms, looking at that from very, very, very hard numbers. But as I said, I don't think I actually think that this, or I was hoping now that we have this discussion, it doesn't seem to me that it came across that way. But I actually thought that this presentation, just showing the potential, actually gave a little bit of hope that there is potential, to free up some land while remaining in terms of overall cattle numbers, and that some of these targets, when we look at the numbers, for example, from the randomized scenarios, there it's very difficult to understand, to say, 1 million, we need 1 million hectares of forest. That's never going to happen. I think showing these pathways on a national scale is very important to show that, I suppose that there is hope, and that there are some specific measures, for example, improving the grassland use efficiency that actually can spare almost half of the land that we're talking about without reducing the numbers of cattle. And then if we combine that with the farm level to actually investigate, actually model how we can achieve that, what specific measures can help on a farm level, scaling that up back to the national level, if you will, that I think we're closer to some of these targets than the numbers appear.
Daniel, just one other question there. There's a lot of work going on and talk at the moment about changing the emissions factors, or that the emissions factors may change based on Irish research, that we're using non-Irish, if you like, emissions factors at the minute. Would that have any impact on your work or on them? I mean, obviously, I presume if they become available, you will include those in your models. But do you think that from what we know about those factors at the moment, will they make any difference or make any dramatic change to your outcomes?
I'm not necessarily sure. I think to know exactly how much of a difference they would make, we would have to run them in a model. So I would stay away from eyeballing a number right now off the spot. But of course, like we when there's new emission factors being published, we try to include them, obviously. Yeah.
And actually, someone made a comment there. I don't know if it's a farmer or it's an advisor or whoever, that good grassland production is still pretty important. That we need to be what you said there a second ago.
Okay, and I think we've come to, or we've dealt with most of the questions.
Through all the questions.
Yeah, Andy, I think you're still breaking up a little bit, unfortunately.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't.
Your connection is not great today. Listen, thank you very much, Daniel. I think thought-provoking. As you say, obviously you are pushing the boundaries for us to learn the potential capabilities. I suspect there's a lot of work to do in terms of trying to build in, as well as the boundaries, to start looking at what can happen with the technologies that we potentially may have to bring to bear on those, and broadening it out. So I suppose we're probably at the start of a journey rather than at the end of a journey in terms of the analysis and the learning from the work that you and your colleagues are doing. So I think, thank you very much. It's given us, I think, a very good insight into I suppose some of those boundaries and the impacts that some of the actions may have. So thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
Next week we'll be joined by Declan Byrne. Declan has been involved with the SUAS project for the last number of years. It's an EIP project that has just finished up, and it's very timely given the level of change of management that's going to come in under the Acres cooperation projects, that we hear some of the experiences that the SUAS project in Wicklow has in terms of upland management and the actions that farmers are taking there. I'd like to say thanks to our production team, Vandy and Yvonne, and Anne, who has joined us today as well to assist. And we'll have a good week, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks very much for joining us today.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.